Welcome to the Who's Left podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from the unapologetic perspective of the social democratic left. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers, and I'm recording from Bloomington. So, as the disorganized American left and center try to piece together some sort of coherent resistance to the Trump mafia and its state level capos like Mike Braun, one of the debates is whether to put your energy into existing institutions or to build new ones. Many on the left have grown tired of the Democratic Party establishment's corruption, cowardice, and complicity, telling Lucy they're done trying to kick that football now. Maybe I'm just a simple Charlie Brown type, but I'm still on record arguing for working within the party for a variety of reasons which I've outlined before, mostly because it's already planted everywhere. And I think we're really going to kick that ball this time. I have a good feeling about it. But look, I understand those who seek to focus their energies elsewhere. But you still don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So, what about other centers of existing institutionalized people power? How about labor unions? Well, the power of organized labor has significantly diminished over the last 40 plus years. Total membership peaked in this country in 1979, but union density had reached its zenith even before that, in the 50s, with about a third of American workers unionized then. The election of Ronald Reagan, and then his stunning decision to fire 11,000 union air traffic controllers in 1981, delivered a back-breaking blow to organized labor, the middle class, and the American dream. Union members now constitute less than 10% of the workforce. But, as much as I would like to blame Reagan for everything, the unions themselves bear some of the blame. Some of the bigger unions became bloated, corrupt bureaucracies that were unresponsive to the rank and file, and none focused on growing the movement so much as maintaining what they had. Despite all this, there are glimmers of new labor militancy, and in sectors where workers had not previously unionized. With a new generation of labor organizers operating in new environments come new techniques, new lessons, and new models for organizing. My guest today talks all about it in his new book, We Are the Union: How Worker to Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big. Eric Blanc is an assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, researching new workplace organizing, strikes, digital labor activism, and working class politics. A longtime activist, Blanc is an organizer trainer in the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which he helped co found in March 2020. He directs the Worker to Worker Collaborative, a center to help unions and rank and file groups scale up their efforts by expanding their members' involvement and leadership. His writings have appeared in journals such as Politics and Society, New Labor Forum, and Labor Studies Journal, as well as publications such as The Nation, The Guardian, and Jacobin. He's also recently been doing the rounds on the podcast circuit, appearing on such outstanding programs as The Dig, Behind the News, and My Labor Radio, but we are grateful he's slumming it here with us today. In this conversation, we'll talk all about the recent labor renaissance, how worker to worker organizing differs from the traditional model, and how technology has shaped the labor movement. We'll also look at what the big established unions can learn from the new generation of organizers and what lessons they can teach. Also, we'll talk about ways you can get involved and how a little corporate espionage is a good time. Real quick, before we jump to the interview, please consider supporting Who's Left with a paid subscription. This is an independent media project. I don't paywall content, and I don't rely on advertising. I do depend on individuals like you. So please, if you find value in my work, go to who'sleft.us and subscribe at the paid level. It's only $5 a month or $50 a year to help me write more, research more, and organize more. I would like to dedicate my full time to you this project and Indiana's future, but I need your financial support to do so. And listen, I know things are uncertain right now, so there are other ways to help grow this community by liking and sharing on social media, commenting, leaving reviews, providing feedback, and forwarding the articles to your people. We are building a community of Hoosiers dedicated to making the state and its government work for all of us, not just the elite few. Follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at Who's Left, and I'm personally at ScottRodge78 on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, and Mastodon. Tell the others. Let's build a radically democratic Indiana together. Thanks again. Now, here is my conversation with Eric Blanc. Eric Blanc, thanks for joining the Who's Left podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, before we really begin, just please introduce yourself briefly. Tell us about yourself, your background in labor organizing, and what kind of brought us to where we are today.
Yeah, I've been involved in the labor movement for over 20 years now. I grew up in working class labor family in the Bay Area. I'm a professor of labor studies at Rutgers now, but I still primarily I see myself as an organizer. I helped co-found the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee at the beginning of the pandemic, which is an organization that supports any worker in any industry, any part of the country, start self-organizing, and then we connect you with a union. So EWOC is sort of the genesis in many ways of this book, because the questions of how do you organize large numbers of workers when you don't have a lot of staff emerged out of that project. And and then just seeing the really remarkable kind of explosion of unionization at Starbucks, Amazon, and all this raised all of these huge debates in the labor movement. And the book is an attempt to both answer and address those questions, and then just to ask the big question of, how would you actually organize tens of millions of workers? And so for me, as both an academic and a organizer, that's the thing that sort of keeps me up at night.
Kind of unrelated to where we're going and the topic of your book, but I understand Rutgers has itself a bit of a history as a hotbed of union activism.
Yeah, no, it's definitely related. Yes, I'm a member of my union, obviously AAP, AFT at Rutgers, and we went on strike 2 years ago. And my favorite moment from that strike was I had this. It's funny. I had a photo I took go viral because I took a picture of the frat boys at Rutgers who were supporting the strike, and I don't even remember the name of the frat now. It was one of it was a frat not known for its this was not like a progressive frat. It's like a very classic bro, had all sorts of questionable history, but these these dudes were really into the strike, and so I think it was a funny picture, but then it was also indicative of the times we're in, where if you even have the frat boys involved in the strike, then times are changing.
Yeah, it really is, and that's I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, home of Indiana University. Fellow Big Ten school. Our labor organizing is way behind. Let's say I talked to somebody last year from the grad workers union, and they're doing good work. But Indiana being a quote unquote right to work state, and we've got a hostile president and board of trustees. It's been a real uphill climb.
Yeah.
So, one of the big things that I've stressed as I've been talking to people a lot lately, as we're trying to build some sort of resistance to the Trump Musk hostile government takeover, at a grassroots level. A lot of folks, I think, are disenchanted with the Democratic Party. They wanted to see more fight out of them, and so I think there's a certain subset of people that are maybe trying to reinvent the wheel or build another structure. And I generally encourage them, hey, use use the structures we've got. It's easier to maybe take them over and use the things we already have than to build something new. And with the failure of the Democratic Party, I think another one of these existing structures that is there is organized labor. Do you agree that that is sort of one of the places where folks have existing, organizing power that maybe is going to play a big role in resisting the administration?
Yeah, I don't think it's just hypothetical either. I mean, we're already seeing it, right? The federal
Yeah,
workers have, in many ways, taken the lead in resisting Trump and Musk, and at no small risk to their own livelihoods. Because you imagine what it's like to be a federal worker, in which Musk is looking for any excuse
yeah,
to downsize and to fire people. So to speak up publicly in itself is an act of courage, and the tide is turning in many ways because of them speaking out. So I think that's just one indication of not just the potential role, but the current role of labor in fighting back. And more generally speaking, I do think the best bet we have for not just defeating Musk in the short term, but for overcoming MAGA, as a project,
yeah,
and is the labor movement, because the labor movement can speak to people's real anger and real concerns, real insecurities and anxieties, but provide an alternative way of understanding the world and an alternative sort of enemy, if you will, which is not the immigrant, not the trans kid, but the billionaires. And there's no organization better placed to make that case. And then, frankly, no organization has the same amount of potential economic and social leverage as the labor movement. So, yeah, without a strong labor movement, I don't see how we defeat Trump.
yeah. Labor's been fighting oligarchy, for its entire existence, right? That's what it kind of exists to do. Um, but organizing labor is different today than it was when we had our last real, you know, the real renaissance of organized labor. Go back to the 30s, the New Deal era, Roosevelt. You know, um, and it's largely been a long, slow decline since then. Is that just like the changing nature of work, or are there other factors at play?
Yeah, you know, it's obviously true to a certain extent that changes in the economy helped undermine the labor movement. So, in particular,
Hmm.
deindustrialization, a lot of the union jobs were just lost, and and then globalization, a lot of the fear of capital flight helped undermine worker militancy. And then more generally, I think that just the rise of the service sector and economic sprawl
Yeah,
has made it harder to organize. People work farther from their coworkers. They don't live in the same sort of neighborhoods as their coworkers. Imagine, in the 1930s, you tended to work in a big factory, and your, next door neighbor worked there too, and you would go out to the bar and
yeah,
afterwards, and at the church. Like, that world has been pulled apart. So I do think that background context is a significant factor. That being said, um, there's no inherent reason why labor unions couldn't organize these new jobs. It's harder, but it's necessary and it's possible. And so there's a subjective factor too of the labor movement, frankly, just not attempting really to organize the tens of millions of new jobs outside of its historic bastions. And that is just a tremendous default. And it's one of the things I try to provide an alternative to with the book is to say the labor movement, not only its decline is, it seems inevitable, but there has been very minimal effort from the labor movement to turn that around. It's not the case that the labor movement is sort of valiantly every year pushing to organize millions of new workers. The vast majority of unions don't try to organize new workers. They just kind of getting by, and have these small islands of union power in the growing sea of corporate domination, and they're not frankly trying that hard. There's exceptions, but the norm is to just service your own union members, and that's it. They're not really thinking about the future of the working class or of the labor movement as a whole. So I do think that that subjective default is a huge part of the reason why the labor movement has declined.
So, it's like as these jobs, a lot of them were being sent overseas, or even more of them usually automated away, right? Um, would you say that maybe the traditional organized labor organizations were sort of married to their existing model, and maybe like struggled to adapt to a world where you don't have like 10,000 guys you can talk to at shift change?
Yeah, that's part of it. Um, I mean, there's so many ways that the labor movement has failed to adapt. Again, just to reiterate, part of it is also just there was a failure to even try to bring in new people. So I wish it were the case that it's just that they're sticking with the old model and it's not working that well. Most cases, frankly, they're not even trying. So the reality is that there's a question of intention and trying to organize, but then the model is outdated on a wide variety of ways. The most salient one that I talk about in the book is that the staff intensivity of labor organizing. So the extent to which labor organizing in the US currently depends on just having a huge number of staff to win is a relic of previous decades that is just frankly completely unable to win at the type of numbers, the type of scale necessary to transform this country. And so model wise, when we're talking about the way that the unions are outdated, that is really the thing I point to most in the book is that in our current moment where so many workers want to unionize, in which we have new digital tools, in which there is a real momentum around the labor movement, and then there's a young radicalization of young people around Black Lives Matter, Bernie, LGBTQ issues. There's just so much more potential for the labor movement to become more of a movement again, and not just sort of a small scale servicing of the labor of small numbers of workers. And that is the road not taken. Essentially, the labor movement hasn't embarked as a whole down that road, even though it's been proven to be able to work.
Is worker to worker unionism. Can you define that? Maybe talk about how it's different from that traditional staff intensive organizing model?
Yeah. Um, the the basic difference is that in a staff intensive model, staff are in charge of training workers, initiating drives, strategy, and in a worker to worker model, the workers themselves, worker leaders themselves, are taking on the responsibilities that these staffers normally do. So it's not that you don't need strategy anymore. It's not that you don't need someone training other workers or initiating drives, but worker leaders themselves have taken on that responsibility. We've seen that at Starbucks, for instance. So just to give an example, so at Starbucks, you might remember in late 2021, just one store unionized in Buffalo, New York, and it caught the
Yeah.
imagination of hundreds and eventually thousands of baristas all across the country who reached out unexpectedly overnight to the small group of baristas in Buffalo, and had the Starbucks campaign tried to maintain a staff intensive sort of traditional model where you have one staffer for every 100 workers, would have a
Yeah.
staffer sort of like intensely coached. There's just no way they would have been able to go viral. They didn't have enough staff to do that. They had almost no staff whatsoever. So they had to have workers themselves get on a Zoom call and talk to coworkers all across the country just to talk to people about what they did to win, give them some basic tools to start self organizing. And so you can see how that role, which in the past would have been done by a staff person, the workers themselves had to do it because there's just no other way that they could have gone as big as quickly as they did.
It sounds like they're more nimble, perhaps.
Yeah, more nimble, but it's yeah, there's a question of how labor movements grow. Labor movements tend to grow not just slow and steady, but in these spurts of excitement and energy. And when you have these spurts in which workers are inspired by seeing others fighting back and they're jumping into the struggle, you can't spread that. You can't support that movement. You can't keep the momentum going in a staff heavy way because it really is reliant on workers getting inspired by other workers and on moving quickly and moving in this grassroots way. That's how it goes viral. And so, yeah, nimble in that sense. I think you're right. In order to be able to pivot to those moments, you need a different type of model.
Yeah, yeah, it's like, a speedboat versus a battleship. It's a lot easier to turn the speedboat than it is to turn a battleship.
Right.
Um, but I guess, with that, you might be s sacrificing, or not sacrificing, because the situation is what it is, you're not giving anything up, but, smaller units, yeah, a store where you have to organize, I don't know, a couple dozen people, is, you can be more nimble in this smaller group, but you're still only a dozen people relative to, you know, this owner. Um, is it easier or harder to organize in this way? Do you think?
With the smaller workplaces, or that's the question?
Well, it's like a trade off, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I think it is a real trade-off. The the reality is that the labor movement has had a higher win rate, so it has been more likely to win in smaller workplaces for almost 50 years now. And I think that's
Hmm.
there's some obvious reasons for that. Is one is if you're in a smaller workplace, it's just easier logistically to talk to all of your coworkers.
Yeah.
Um, you might already have pre-existing relationships with all of them in a way that you wouldn't necessarily at a big workplace. Um, and so that's the positive part. The negative is that in order to win unions for large numbers of workers, it's just a lot more cost intensive to do small workplaces because like at
Hmm.
Starbucks, they had to win 550 stores and they've gotten over 11,000 workers that way. That's just a huge undertaking because there's so many different stores, so many different union elections. And if you had a couple big factories, it would have the same number of workers. But on the other hand, most workers don't work in big factories anymore. So we don't have the luxury of being able to only concentrate on really massive workplaces to this the extent which in the 1930s you could. You just can't do that today. Most workers do work in smaller workplaces that are spread out. So you have to actually meet workers where they're at. You need to have a strategy that can win both for smaller workplaces and for big workplaces. And I do think that this bottom up worker to worker model is the only way that I've really seen a compelling vision for how you could organize at scale both types of workplaces.
Yeah. So, what would you say is like is the key success factor of the worker to worker model? The individual relationships, the intimacy, kind of the like almost small group model. I talked to a lot of religious scholar people that talk about Christian nationalism and church planting in small groups, and it's kind of like that same model in its own way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that look, unionization at its best, I do see is I see it as somewhat similar to church in a good way, where you really have an
Yeah.
intense sort of social community. It's not just about dollars and cents, but it's about feeling part of something bigger, both in terms of connection with other people, and then frankly also just having a purpose in life that is beyond yourself. That you're part of a project that's gonna impact the world and live beyond you. And I think a lot of people are looking for all of those things. I don't think it's the case that the reason people turn to the far right or the reason uh, people engage with politics is just a sort of purely self-motivated economic interest. I think economics are central. So I do think that's really important. People act in their self-interest. but people are also trying to make sense of the world, and they're trying to understand their place in it. And you know, the labor movement can provide that in a very beautiful way, a feeling of solidarity and community and empowerment. It's my favorite thing about writing this book and interviewing people is just hearing workers tell stories about how it transformed their life. They'll never be the same. I have this quote from one worker who was a baker at Collectivo, which is a coffee chain in the Midwest. And he has this quote saying, "I've never experienced anything like unionizing. Nothing compares to it. Not getting married, not having my kids being born, nothing compares to unionization." I was like, "Oh wow, I would never." Like my wife would kill me if I ever said that, but it does give you,
Uh,
it gives you a sense of how
a
powerful an
different,
experience it can be. Yeah,
yeah, a
I'm sure.
different kind of exhilaration. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is something I do think about a lot as I'm talking with the the pastors and the scholars of Christian nationalism. Is there's not a parallel community gathering place on the left that they have like the religious right has some of these big churches.
Yeah, I think that's right, and there's some truth, I think, to the idea that the left isn't as welcoming as it could be, and I think that's really to our detriment. I think part of what churches do well and do right is try to provide a welcoming environment for people who aren't necessarily on board but are trying to like figure out where they're at or maybe looking for a community. The left doesn't have that ethos really, and it's a real flaw because
Hmm.
if people you want to make it as easy as possible for people to join, and you want to be proactively trying to get people to join. And I think sometimes the left can feel like kind of an insular club if you don't use the right language or if you don't do this, that, or the other. And so there is a need, I think, to be open to people if even if they're not fully on board yet. And then part of that is then people change their opinions and change their views in the process of organizing and in the process of becoming part of something bigger. And so I think you're right as far as the social space and a welcoming um, sort of environment. Yeah, unions can provide that. The left as a whole just doesn't have maybe the scale of it. Doesn't seem your average worker is going to have a lot of opportunities to join a church much more than they're going to join a union or a left organization because we're just too small still. But we need to provide that alternative as soon as possible.
Yeah, the union hall as it was isn't really a thing so much anymore. I mean, particularly in these kind of the new smaller worker to worker union models. Is that? I mean, is there a place you go?
Yeah, I mean the union hall. Yeah, there aren't really union halls to the same extent that they were before, and I do think that speaks to real changes in political economy. Part of the reason you could have a union hall that was like a real sort of social hub was when workers lived much closer to each other, commute times were
Yeah.
lower, suburbanization was less, people tended to live in more concentrated neighborhoods. And so now people live much further from each other, they commute to work, they don't have the same sort of pre-existing dense social ties to each other, and so that the union hall as such is very rare. It's an exception. That doesn't mean that the function it played can't be replicated. I do think that you see workers, the equivalent of a union hall today, frankly, in most organizing spaces I know is probably like the group chat. It's true, but you have a lot of
Yeah.
workers but it's true, that's where they're talking smack about the boss and they're sharing memes and they're, commiserating. And so it's not the same, and it has its limitations. It has some benefits, but it's probably the closest we have in many circumstances. And it's not to say that in-person organizing isn't necessary. And most good organizing combines the digital stuff with in-person get-togethers because there's something about obviously getting together in person. But when you live really far from each other, sometimes a chat is going to be your best bet for like staying in touch, and that's why I think they are so pervasive.
Yeah. Well, this is something I was going to come at later, but I think this is the right place to bring it in. is the way that technology has changed labor organizing. The group chat is a relatively new phenomena. Some people like the the nation's intelligence higher ups are still trying to figure out how to do it. Um, but has new stuff like Zoom and group chats and texts and messenger and whatnot changed the way that we organize.
Yeah, I mean, part of the argument I make in the book is that digital tools have dramatically changed the organizing terrain, um, and in many ways for the better. What they do is two things that I talk about, particularly when it comes to worker organizing. The first is they lower organizing costs, so it makes it easier
Mm,
to self organize. So, like if, for instance, if you can meet over Zoom or a chat rather than having to rent a hall like you had to in the past, well, it allows workers to start self organizing even before they have significant resources. So it makes the dependence of workers on existing unions less. It doesn't mean that they don't eventually probably want to connect with a union, but you can really get things started much more easily now than you could have even 10 years ago because you have these tools. And then second, it allows worker organizing to happen beyond the local level because up until really again probably 10 years ago, more or less, the only way you could have a worker coaching another worker is if they lived in the same city, where they were able to
yeah.
meet in person. But now, because of Zoom and other technologies like that, you can have a barista in Buffalo, New York, training, face to face with a worker in Mesa, Arizona, or in Los Angeles, and so it allows workers
Yeah.
to not have to rely on staff for organizing on a statewide level or on a nationwide level, and that just dramatically expands the scope then for bottom up organizing compared to the past.
And young people, like you previously mentioned, seem to be driving a lot of the new union efforts, and they've grown up in these digital spaces and really know how to navigate those. Probably in a lot of cases better than management does.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely the case. There's a generational piece to this. Although I was actually surprised. One of the things I found in the book is the extent to which even older workers really these days are using technology a lot. For older workers, it tends to be
Hmm.
much more rudimentary, like Facebook. But a lot of the older workers really watched a lot of Facebook videos and were on Facebook chats. Blue collar workers like, are on Facebook. And then similarly, a lot of
Yeah,
immigrant
yeah.
workers
If it
are
works, it works,
on.
right?
Yeah, and a lot of immigrant workers are on WhatsApp in particular. So,
Hmm.
yeah, there's different tools are used differently by or different tools are used by different sectors of the workforce. But really, the norm across the board these days is to use digital tools pretty widely.
The bosses do have digital tools, though, right? Surveillance and whatnot. Yeah, I'm sure they use all sorts of. I mean, they have all the data in the world they could possibly want on just about anybody at their disposal, so they could find people's predilections or whatnot. I imagine. Are the owners using technology to counter the uh, union's technology in
Yeah,
organizing? Yeah.
the 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 reality, of course, is that of course management is using uh, data against workers and for surveillance. And so it is scary. And I think particularly I think about Trump and Musk using data for frankly police state measures right now. I think just today I saw they picked up a graduate student off the streets in Tufts
Yeah.
from Tufts
Yeah, yeah, I
University.
saw that.
So
Horrible.
it's just yeah, horrible. It's just terrifying. You know, that being said, I I think our organizing is always public. I think I think there can be a tendency to move too far in the other direction of fearing that management has all of our information. And the reality is, none of the organizing we're doing really is secret. We're very public about it. Organizing is, really is a public activity, and it's legal. And I don't think that we have that much to gain by trying to err on the side of secrecy. Of course, there's moments in a union campaign where you have to sort of stay underground first. So, in the initial parts of an organizing campaign, before you want to get before you go public, which is the term, when you let management know. Yeah, well, at those moments, you can err on the side of caution. Be really careful not to use like a work email, things like that. But beyond that, really, what we're doing is we have the legal right to unionize, and I think we need to, if anything, lean into the public piece and say, okay, if you have our data, great. Who cares? I'm a public union supporter. I'm going to wear this button to show you I'm a union supporter. I'm not keeping it hidden. And I think that ethos is pretty important right now, because one of the things that Trump is trying to do, and what management always tries to do, is keep people scared. And one of the ways they
Mhm.
keep people scared is by having people stay silent, right? And you don't realize how many people already agree with you unless people are speaking up publicly. And so I do think that the public, um, sort of very public facing, not cowing, showing you're not afraid, is pretty important for unionizing in general and for defeating Trump in particular.
Yeah. Um, you talked about some of the major union victories over the last several years. You talked about Starbucks. There was a push at Amazon there for a little bit. Um, what do you think has been like the most surprising or inspiring uh, union story over the last several years?
Hmm. I think I think that the Starbucks story is maybe still the most surprising and inspiring. It's this is a company that nobody would have thought you could have unionized before they did it.
Yeah.
Um, the assumption was that the company is too strong. This is one of the biggest companies in the world. Has, I think it's the eighth largest company in terms of workforce in the U.S. It's too spread out. So you have thousands and thousands of workplaces all across the US, small workplaces. So logistically, it's impossible. How could you organize so many small workplaces? And then plus the turnover is high. So you try to build a workplace organizing committee, and half the people are gone within half a year. And so the assumption was impossible, at least until like labor law reform was passed, and that turned out to be wrong. The prevailing wisdom of the labor movement was wrong, and workers showed it to be wrong. Workers showed that you can organize these big companies if you get enough workers on board. So you have to try to find ways to make the organizing go viral. Part of that is having inspiring victories. Part of it is using social media really well. Starbucks Workers United, in the book, I give some numbers. I don't remember the specifics off the top of my head, but I think it was over 150 million views on TikTok alone for Starbucks Workers
Wow.
United. So they really made a really concerted effort to spread using social media, because that's how you, many ways, to generate new leads. Get workers excited about what you're doing, get them connected to the union, and they were able to do that to a really remarkable extent. And they ended up getting support from some big unions like Workers United and SCIU, but really workers drove it from below, and they persevered despite just intense union busting. What Bernie Sanders called the worst union busting campaign in modern U.S. history. This is true. They terrorized
Mhm.
thousands of workers. They fired hundreds of workers, denied rights, equal rights to tens of thousands of workers, just blatantly broke labor law over and over and over and over again, shutting down stores. They did everything possible to destroy these workers and their resolve and their morale, and they haven't succeeded. The workers are stronger than they've ever been. They're at over 550 stores, and they've forced management to the bargaining table, and they're in the process now of bargaining their final contract. And I think people are optimistic that that's going to happen. So yeah, it's pretty remarkable. If they do get that first contract, it's going to be the biggest union victory in the private sector since the 1930s, I would say.
Wow, that's I mean, that's massive. Yeah. Um, so the Starbucks, you'd really say, changed the landscape of union activism.
Yeah, for sure. I
Uh,
mean, it's yeah.
well, okay, so now you mentioned before that uh, traditional unions were not investing enough in organizing. Um, so I guess what should they have been doing differently? And then can the bigger, more traditional unions learn something from this worker to worker unionism?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing unions should be doing is just investing a lot more in organizing, period. You know, your average union, is a union local. That's where the most of the money is on a local basis in the labor movement. Most union locals do zero, exactly zero new organizing, trying to bring in new members. So you need to dramatically turn that around. The goal really should be having unions spending 20 to 30% of their budgets on bringing in new members. So without that, it's going to be very hard to scale up. But then, even with that money, if you're doing it through just the sort of traditional model where you hire a bunch of staff, you're not going to be able to organize
Mhm.
the millions of workers you need. There's not enough staff. There's not enough money, even if you use all of it. So the labor movement does. It's not just that it could, but it has to. It has to massively invest in this type of organizing that we've seen in Starbucks, that we've seen in media, we've seen in auto, and with the UAW organizing. And that looks like, it looks like, for instance, hiring, um, staff who can scale up campaigns in a way that workers take the lead. So you can look at what the News Guild has done in journalism, and they've been able to build this infrastructure in which workers are trained to do everything that a staff normally does. And they've organized hundreds of different newspapers across the country. It could mean recruiting thousands of salts. So salting is when you take a job at a targeted company or workplace in order to unionize it. And I think that's a really important tactic that we saw in this recent uptick, at Starbucks and at Amazon and beyond.
Mm.
And I think that we need a lot more salts, frankly. And I'll give a pitch for salting if anyone's interested. Democratic Socialists of America is has launched a new salting program, so you can get connected to Starbucks and Amazon and a lot of different crucial um, campaigns as a salt. You could go to the the website is bit.ly, so bit.ly/salt now if you want to get connected.
Hmm.
And so that's another good
Sounds like
initiative.
fun. It's like being a spy, right?
It has its, especially at first before you're public, it has elements of a good sort of spy thriller. Yeah, like can you stay underground, and can you trick the management into not realizing what you're up to? There's an element of duplicity as far as management goes that's necessary, because frankly these companies don't respect labor law. If they respected labor law, you
Yeah.
wouldn't need to sort of mask things like you do. But because they're so vicious, there's some level of having to, you know, having to not tell management the truth. And that's just sort of a necessary part of it. So I think there's a lot of different initiatives labor unions could do, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The book tries to show what this could look like, and what other unions could do.
Are there lessons that these these young whippersnappers, the new generation of union organizers, need to absorb from the traditional unions that maybe they have not yet, or um, just important organizing things so they're not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, it cuts both ways. Yeah, I would say that one of the really important insights of labor organizers that's been accumulated through a lot of experience is that in order to win, it's not enough just to fight. You know, fighting is really important. It's probably the precondition for anything else. But you do need to come up with a strategy to win and a strategy to sort of organize a big company and to organize the industry. Because your goal is not just to win a union election, but it's to win a good first contract that can really raise workers' standards. And that tends to require a pretty thought out strategic vision and campaign. And I think that some of these grassroots unionization drives, understandably, get into the fight before they have that plan,
Mm,
because
mhm.
they're riled up. But I think there is a necessity for, in the process of the fight, developing that strategy. How are you going to organize the industry? How are you going to how are you going to really like create the basis for transformative wins that can remain solid and strong enough to transform workers' lives and to make the union sort of very meaningful part of their lives and their families' lives. So I do think that as a sort of more long-standing tradition in the labor movement is pretty crucial.
Yeah. Is there be the inkling or the first seeds of seeing maybe some synergy between these different styles kind of coming together?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in many ways, that is the argument in my book. Is it's not that you just workers on their own can do it. I don't think that that's true. I think that workers need the resources and the support of big unions. The question is what form those resources take, and what form of support the movement can give. And so we have seen that all of the biggest successes in the last few years have been through the synthesis of grassroots initiative and leadership, but with real institutional backing. So that's the case at Starbucks. Starbucks is an affiliate now of SEIU, one of the biggest. The Starbucks Workers United is an
Mhm.
affiliate of one of the biggest unions in the country, SEIU. The News Guild is part of CWA, the Communication Workers of America, a big union. The Amazon Labor Union started independent, but precisely because of this need for more resources, they affiliated with the Teamsters. So I do think that there's a way of frankly, a necessity for combining the best of bottom up and the best of top down, for lack of a better term, approaches.
And do you think that's the future of labor organizing in the U.S.?
Yeah, I do. I think that the future is giving workers the driving wheel. So they're driving the strategy, driving the fight back, but with the gas and the energy and the resources of a big established union, I think at least to beat the biggest companies, that's the only way forward.
With anything, right? It's like the more you can pool resources and put things together, the better chance you have, right? What is your biggest hope for the labor movement over the next, say, 5 to 10 years? Are we in for some rough times for the next 4 years or so? Uh, do you? I mean, some segment of the MAGA movement has maybe eh, made motions toward unions, even though they're typically have been hostile. Do we take that at its word, or are they lying as they typically do? Just what do you see happening in the short to medium term
Yeah, I think the immediate moment is that Trump and Musk are massively attacking labor unions. They just unilaterally 2 weeks ago uh, ignored, or they destroyed, at least legally, the TSA workers union. And so all of a sudden 50,000 workers, the government said, oh yeah, we're not going to respect your collective bargaining contract anymore. So the offensive that the Trump administration and Musk in particular are doing in the federal sector is just a huge threat to the whole labor movement. This is not just going to impact these workers, but it's going to set a precedent for any employer in the country to uh, you know start unilaterally ignoring unions, even if they've been bargaining with them for 100 years. If they could do it in the federal sector, why wouldn't any employer just start saying, "Oh, I don't have to listen to the union anymore. Who's gonna
Yeah,
enforce labor
right.
law
It's
against
the
me?"
federal government that's been keeping them,
Right,
making sure they do, right?
right,
If the government
yeah.
isn't, yeah,
Yeah, so I
right.
mean, I think there's an existential threat to the labor movement. Trump administration is an existential threat, and I frankly, am, concerned the labor movement hasn't been up to the task yet of the fight. Labor movement moves very slowly, and, is not normally used to having to wage big, risky fights, and that is what's called for at this moment. So I think that there's a huge opening because, Trump is unpopular. Destroying people's social security is not a good way to get popularity up. This is a pretty good way to
Yeah.
dramatically undermine any support you might have. So the labor movement could step into the void of the Democrats, because Democrats are MIA basically at this point, and the labor movement is in a good position to cohere a force, a majoritarian force, as an alternative to MAGA. But it's really gonna be up to new leadership to push in a different direction, because labor movement leadership at this point is caught very flat-footed.
It sounds like almost the traditional union leadership and the Democratic Party leadership are sort of in the same boat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends on which union. So, some unions are fighting. I think most unions are fighting a little bit, but they're not fighting as hard as they should be. So maybe they're a little bit better than the Democratic Party, where a lot of the Democratic Party is just not fighting. Period. I would say the norm labor unions are fighting somewhat. It's just not anywhere with the intensity or the strategic sort of vision and drive that this moment requires.
I know. Well, around here, we're fans of fellow Hoosier Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, and he's targeted May 2028 for a general strike. I know, like a lot of the unions have been sort of setting up their contracts to expire at the same time, uh, to maybe, like we were saying, pool resources, pool the pressure you can put on the system by having, many workers on the picket lines at the same time, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been really inspired by the UAW. Um, I think that Sean Fain and the whole new UAW leadership is just really pointing a new way forward for the union movement as a whole. So it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the work they're doing, not just in auto, but for labor generally, with their call to unify forces and to take strike action. So yeah, I agree 100%.
Hmm. Yeah, I know, like a lot of the grad workers, various at various universities are partnered with UAW, which seems like a an unusual partnership, but yet it seems to be working for both of them.
Right. Yeah, 100%. This is, yeah, it's in many ways the future of the labor movement. How do you get the blue collar workers on the same fighting, struggle and the same union as some of the, more classical white collar workers like grad students? And it's not easy.
Hmm.
It's not like kumbaya. That there are real tensions in that coalition, but that is the type of coalition that can win, because it's the coalition that represents the working class as it is, which is very diverse, not just in terms of race and geography, but in terms of its occupation. So yeah, without that broad unity, I don't think we're gonna have the power necessary to defeat Trump and the billionaires.
Yeah. Um, well, before I get to my last question, I wanted to ask you if there's anything that we've sort of glossed over that you wanted to make sure we get to before we wrap up here today.
Yeah. The I would just say a few concrete things for anyone listening, how you can get involved in supporting. We haven't talked about it as much, but I do think that the most important battle right now is the federal, workers. I talked about it a bit, but if you are interested in supporting the federal workers, or if you're a federal worker yourself, go to the website savepublicservices.com. That you can sign up there to get notified of upcoming actions in support of federal workers in your town, wherever you live, but also to volunteer to organize, whether you're a community member or a federal worker, to beat Elon Musk and his destruction of the federal workforce. So I do think that that's like the crucial battle. And so we need to go all
Mhm.
in on making sure that they win. The second piece that I didn't mention is the website for EWOC. As I mentioned at the top, I helped co-found this organization, Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which has now blossomed into a really sort of powerful institution that supports any worker in any part of the country unionized. And so you can organize your own workplace. You don't need to wait for anybody. And the best way to do that is to reach out to EWOC to get started. And so you can go to workerorganizing.org, workerorganizing.org. And if you fill out a quick form on there, then a experienced volunteer organizer will get back to you within 72 hours and help you start organizing your coworkers to build a union, to build power at work. And then the third thing is just, as I mentioned before, become a salt. If you're trying to figure out how you can have the biggest impact on the world, a big part of that would be getting a job as a salt. Starbucks, Amazon, maybe an auto. These are crucial campaigns that need your support. So you can do that. You go to bit.ly/salt now and sign up. And I think any of these avenues, all of these avenues, are just crucial steps that you should take right now to change the world. It's not a moment for resignation. I think a lot of people are just sort of in political despair because of Trump and the state of the world. But I think it's a moment to fight back, and I think that we can win. These people up top are clowns, and they're evil clowns, but they're people we
Yeah.
can they're people we can overcome.
Yeah, yes, their their own incompetence will be their undoing, hopefully. And, you preempted my last question, which is good because I was going to ask, if you are interested in organizing your workplace, what do you need to do? And you say, contact Ewok. That is, step 1.
Yeah. So yeah, EWOC, if to organize your workplace. If you want to support the federal workers, savepublicservice.com. And then if you want to get a job at a strategic workplace, SALT. So, bit.ly/SALT now.
Excellent. Appreciate all of this. Great info. We're going to link all these in the show notes and tell the people where to get your book. And where can people find you?
Yeah. The best place to find my work is at my Substack, which is laborpolitics.com. So, yeah, I publish there, maybe a couple times a month. So if you just go to laborpolitics.com, sign up, it's free. That's probably the best place to find my work and get a copy of my new book. We Are the Union. Basically, anywhere you buy books online or in person, you
And
should be able to
yeah,
get a copy.
we will link to that and to your Substack and Eric Blanc. Thanks so much for joining me here tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Once again, that was labor organizer, professor, and author Eric Blanc. In 2020, COVID showed many workers how little their bosses cared for their health and safety, so these essential workers began demanding PPE, hazard pay, and appropriate staffing. Blanc and his co founders launched the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee to equip them with the resources, the networks, and the training they need to win their demands. Though the acute phase of the pandemic has long passed, EWOC continues to help workers organize. Labor's need for material support is evergreen. Now, I wasn't in the room when this committee was founded, so I don't know if the acronym was chosen intentionally, but when I hear Ewok, I immediately think of Star Wars. And coincidence or not, I think those Ewoks offer a valuable lesson about solidarity, so let's visit the evergreen forest moon of Endor. Return of the Jedi, the last battle. You've got your slick, well armed rebels, your white collar insurgents with their plans, their code names, their high tech ships. And then you've got the locals, the Ewoks, 3 foot tall teddy bear Muppets armed with sticks and stones and a deep generational loathing of fascist occupation. And together, they take down the most powerful empire in the galaxy. That's not just a heartwarming sci fi story. That's the Union playbook that will beat our fascist occupiers. Right there on the screen. The Empire is exactly what it always is: a bloated, top down machine of extraction and repression, run by fragile old dudes in robes who believe they'll rule forever, enforced by disposable soldiers and powered by the assumption that no one will dare fight back, that the oppressed will stay divided, that the little people will stay in their places, bickering over who gets to suffer more politely. But that's not what happens in the movie. The rebels and the Ewoks, the strategic and the scrappy, realize they've got a common enemy, and when they move together, it's over. See, here's the thing: the bosses, the billionaires, the petty tyrants of our world never want you to internalize. A blue collar or a white collar is still a collar. You might work behind a counter or behind a desk. You might wear steel toe boots or a badge on a lanyard. You might punch a clock or you might punch a keyboard, but if you don't own the place, you probably want to punch the boss. You're on the same damn side. Different tools, same chains. That is what the future of labor organizing must understand. That's what solidarity demands. That the people who earn a paycheck, all of them, realize that they are all being exploited by the same empire, just in different ways. At one point in the battle, Harrison Ford's swaggering Han Solo reluctantly accepts assistance from a tiny Ewok, saying, "Well, short help is better than no help at all." And yeah, maybe at first industrial workers, hospitality workers, tech workers, and academic workers might think the others wouldn't understand their struggle, that there's nothing that they could bring to the fight. But our skills complement each other, and there's a place for everybody in the resistance. Every time a CEO gets dragged to the bargaining table by a coalition of people that they thought would never talk to each other, that is another Imperial Walker going down in the woods. The Empire doesn't fall because someone files the right paperwork or if we vote harder. It falls because the people it depends on to code the systems, to clean the floors, to ship the packages, to keep the whole rotten machine running, stop playing along. According to no less authoritative source than Wikipedia, George Lucas always intended that a primitive race should overthrow the Empire in what was intended at that time to be the final episode. A lesson that even the most seemingly overmatched group can overcome great power by working together. Do not underestimate a unified working class. If you do, don't be surprised when the forest rises up and burns your empire to the goddamn ground. What do you think? Let us know. Reach out on social media. I'm on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at Who's Left, and on most other social media sites at ScottRaj78. You can also email me at scott@whosleft.us. Thank you for listening, and thanks again to our guest, Eric Blanc. Subscribe to his Substack, Labor Politics, And his book, We Are the Union, is available from University of California Press, wherever you get your books, but preferably from your local independent bookshop. And after that purchase, if your budget allows and you value this work, how about a paid subscription over at whosleft.us, where you can also find my entire archive. Hit me up on social media with your feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns. Please forward the show to a friend and have them forward it to another friend. Let's keep building this project and a truly democratic state, one conversation at a time. Until the next one, this has been the Who's Left Podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.